In this video, I want to talk quickly about a digital painting method that I call, well, simply the method. I've had over the many years that I've been teaching digital illustration, many students come up to me and ask, what is the best way to begin digital painting? There are so many ways to paint digitally. There is one way that I like to suggest to all my first-time digital painters, and that is a collection of techniques that together I just call the method. This illustration here by James Jean exhibits a lot of those techniques and characteristics. This file here, as well as this illustration here, are basically two versions of the same illustration used for one of the covers of his Fable comic book series. Both these illustrations are layered Photoshop files that I will give to you and that you can take apart. What's interesting about both of these is that I believe he created two versions as he was trying to capture a late afternoon sunset sort of glow. Here you can see he's used a rim light technique on his characters, and I think he eventually decided on something a little bit more color saturated like this, using some color overlay layers. Both of these illustrations, though, utilize this technique that I call the method. Now I encourage you to take a look at these illustrations and go through them layer by layer. Start at the bottom and solo these layers one at a time. To do so, just hold down the Option button and click on the eyeball within the Layers panel to solo a layer. So there you can see I've soloed the beginning layer. To bring back the visibility of the layers that I've just turned off, again, hold down the Option button and click on that eyeball once more, and you can see the layers come back. In this way, we can solo these layers individually. Here I've done the first one, and then reveal each layer in turn. I'm not going to go through this particular illustration and its layers, but you can see as I turn on each subsequent layer, we get a slight modification in how this illustration appears. But I'm just going to reveal both of the layers for both of these illustrations, and you can start to see how they differ slightly. I also have some other illustrations by James Jean here. This particular illustration is actually an illustration that has been saved in sequence. So this is the beginning part of this illustration, then it eventually moves on to this, and then we see the final illustration here. Again, we have a layered Photoshop file to work from. It's definitely a good idea to go through these one at a time to see exactly how these illustrations are structured. Now this illustration style is used by a number of other illustrators, and I just want to bring up their names here. Stanley Lau, for example, uses a version of this illustration method for his Pepper series, as well as Capilano graduate Aaron Campbell. It's also seen in this work here. Now what you're seeing here is something that I've created using exactly the layer structure that I've laid out in this template. But lest you think this is merely a technique that you can pull out when you're trying to convey high realism, we're also going to take a look at this picture here. This is a picture that I've recently been working on. It's not quite done, but it does utilize this same method, but in a way that is meant to look like pastel painting. At least that's my intent with this. I want this to look like a pastel rendering. But this is also utilizing this very same technique. Let's begin with this rendering here. I'm going to open up the Layers panel and we'll see just how this illustration was constructed. I'm going to start from the bottom. I'm going to solo these layers one at a time. First of all, I'm just going to hold down my Option button and click on the bottom layer. That is just our blank white background layer. But above that, I have a layer that I've called Form. You can see here I've just used my render brush to create some very, well, high-toned shadowed form here. I haven't gone too dark with my shading. That was sort of on purpose. I knew I was going to do something later that was going to fix that. You can see that form layer, it's just set to the normal blend mode. But above that, I've got a new layer called Highlights. Let me turn that one on, and you can see that that is adding, as the layer's name suggests, some highlights to where the highlights I think were going to fall. I've also set that particular layer to screen mode, allowing me to lighten whatever tone I'm adding color to. Now above that, I have an adjustment layer, and if I turn on that particular adjustment layer, you can see that that layer is actually affecting my values. I've used a levels slider for this. If I double click that, you can see here are my sliders, and I've added a little bit more dark using my dark slider here, and a little bit of more value in my mid slider. Come back to my layers panel. Above that, I've created something called a gradient map. And again, this is created by coming down to the bottom of your layers panel and clicking on your adjustment layers menu, and you can see that one of the options is here, gradient map. Let me see what happens when I apply a gradient map to an adjustment layer. I'm going to turn that on, and you can see that it allows me to apply color to the various values of my drawing. Here, let me quickly show you how this works. I'm going to double click that icon here to bring up my gradient map adjustment layer controls, and I'm just going to click once inside this gradient slider to bring up my gradient editor. And you can see what's happened here. I have got 3 color stops that have been mapped to the dark to the light tones of my drawing. For the darkest tones, I've mapped this dark blue color. If I click here, you can see just how dark I've made that tone. I've kept it fairly high intensity, but I do want that dark tone to be fairly cool, and I did want it to be fairly dark in value. I wanted it to match at least the value of the undertone drawing. I'm going to say OK. The next color stop in my gradient map is a warm color. I'm just going to open up that, and you can see this again is mapped to a mid value in my color cube here, but I'm using a fairly warm color. That is on purpose. I did want to gradate my color from cool to the darkest shadows to warm in the mid-tones. I'm going to say OK. But finally, I have another color stop mapped to the lightest parts of my drawing, and if I click on that, you can see I've got this very cool blue but very high-toned color. I like to do this with my highest tone colors to make them cool. I could make this warm here if I just come down here and choose a warm yellow. That has a different tone to it, completely different tone to it. I don't know why I love to work with those cool colors, so I'm just going to say cancel. That brings me back to those cool tones. That is essentially my underpainting. The next layer in our sequence is this color layer. Let me turn this on and you can see what's going on here. This color layer has been set to a blend mode of soft light. I really like this particular blend mode for adding color over top of a toned drawing. You'll see this technique sometimes used where people will set the color layer to a blend mode of color. I find this a little bit harder to control. That's why I prefer to use soft light as my blend mode. Now what this layer is doing is I can just paint into this layer using my render brush, using whatever local color that I want to apply here. Because this is skin tone, I've gone in with a combination of warm and cool tones. Painting into this layer just allows me to choose whatever local color and paint right into that layer. What I love about this particular soft light blending mode is how it adds this color in a very gentle way. Again, I'm just using my render brush to apply this color here in a sort of smooth gradient. It is providing a lovely tone to my underpainting. Now this next layer is an interesting layer. I call it the highlight color layer, and if I turn that on, you can see what's happening here. The highlight color layer has been set to the overlay blending mode, and the overlay blending mode gives whatever color is on that layer a saturated intensity that really looks good when it surrounds the highlight layer areas of an illustration. Now you don't have to utilize this, but it does lend a certain sort of light intensity to images. I particularly love this technique when applying red to areas of transition of light and shadow on a face, because it really does sort of suggest the subsurface scattering that we see as light enters into a translucent surface like the skin. Anyway, this is a really lovely layer. Again, not necessary, but it is a really nice technique. Now this next layer here is my shadow layer, and let me just quickly turn that on and show you what is actually happening. So I have created a layer that was nothing but this dark purple color here. You can sort of see it in my preview window in my layers panel. I've created an opacity mask for that layer, and into that opacity mask I've painted black to begin to reveal the painting underneath. Let me just quickly show you what I'm talking about here. So here, taking away some of the masking that was over top of his nose and forehead to reveal a little bit more of what's underneath. Actually, I don't think I quite painted out enough earlier, so we can see how that is bringing the form underneath. But what I love about this technique is it really does harmonize the color within the shadow parts. I'm just going to remove some of that here. It's always fun to do this because it often feels like you're turning on the lights. The next layer I call the specular glow layer. I'm going to turn that on, and you can see what this layer is doing is creating a real interesting rim light. It doesn't have to be utilized as a rim light, but in this case, I thought it was kind of effective and dramatic. What's interesting about this layer is that this layer has got an effect applied to it. And if I open up that effect, you can see that it is the outer glow effect of this orange color set to overlay. Just going to say OK. Let me zoom in to show you what this layer is actually doing. You can see a bit of that specular glow on the tip of his nose here. I'm just going to turn off that glow, and you can see that that little bit of extra orange set to overlay is giving us, again, just a little bit of that extra bit of light transition as it models around that skin. I've always thought this was an interesting technique. Again, not absolutely necessary. This layer here above that is just that background blue. I'm utilizing that above the rest of the image. Going to zoom back out. Let's take a look at the next layer. This next layer here I call Gleams. This layer is just merely using some soft radial gradients set to color dodge, overlaid over top of the rest of the illustration. And you can see how those are adding light and atmosphere to our illustration. I've got one more kind of glow light in the background there, the heart, and finally the monocle that he's wearing. Let's take a look at this illustration, and I'll open up the layers panel. Again, we'll begin at the bottom of the layer stack. I'll just solo this bottom canvas layer here, and you can see that it started off at a certain size, but I've resized it since. But that is essentially the toned canvas that I started with. And over top of that, I have these two layers, the tint layer and my tone layer. And you can see basically, in this case, I've gone in with both my render brush and a pastel brush to create something that's a little bit more textured. On top of that, I've applied my levels adjustment layer, and then I tried out a couple of different gradient maps. This first one was a bit too dark. I ended up going with this one. I thought that was a little bit more high contrast. My next layer is the color layer, and that is my soft light layer. I've worked extensively on this layer using my pastel brushes. Over top of that, though, I still have this highlight color layer where I've added some rim light, and I've painted yellow into that layer to create this really interesting rim light situation. I've got this purple shadow color that overlies the entire thing, but I've masked out that by painting black into my mask. And you can see as I paint away the mask, I get to add some more light into my illustration. Over top of that, I have another gleam layer. I've called it background glow in this case, but you can see what I'm trying to do is pick up on some of that blue-green that was in the background and set that as a color dodge layer over top of my illustration. So let's use these techniques and layers inside our digital painting template. In our next video, we are going to apply these techniques to an exercise here in our digital painting template.